It was a calm evening over the Pacific Ocean on July 14, 1942. The sky had turned a hazy gold, waves gently brushing against the sides of several American warships patrolling in formation. To the sailors aboard the USS Monaghan, it felt like just another day on duty, routine, uneventful, and deceptively quiet. The sunset painted a serene picture, masking the unseen predator beneath the waves. At approximately 1948 hours, a chilling silence fell across the radar room of the USS Monaghan. One of the junior radar operators noticed a faint, fast-moving object approaching their starboard side. Before the alarm could even be raised, a deafening explosion rocked the vessel. A torpedo had struck. Water burst upward in a furious column of fire and steel. The torpedo was not ordinary. It was Japan's Type 93, also known as the Long Lance, a technological marvel capable of devastating impact. The first strike had crippled the Monaghan's hull, sending dozens of sailors flying across the deck. Below, in the engine room, chaos erupted as power systems began to fail and flooding commenced at a terrifying pace. Just minutes after the first hit, a second explosion echoed across the water. Another American ship, the USS Ralph Talbot, had been struck in the rear. Crew members scrambled to stabilize their position, unaware that a third torpedo was already on its way, this time heading straight for the USS Blue. Panic began to spread, but orders were firm: hold position and return fire. Unbeknownst to the Americans, a Japanese I-boat, most likely an I-19 class submarine, had positioned itself miles away, using the cover of twilight and wave distortion to remain invisible. Its torpedoes were guided by nothing but meticulous calculations and relentless precision. The Long Lance torpedoes didn't need to be smart. They only needed to be fast and fatal. The third impact was perhaps the most catastrophic. The USS Blue was rocked violently by the torpedo, losing half its stern to the explosion. Men were thrown into the sea, cries for help mixed with the roar of fire and metal. On the surface, lifeboats were deployed frantically as officers issued abandon ship orders amid total communication blackout. News of the attack reached the Pacific Command within hours, but even seasoned military officials couldn't believe what they were hearing. 3 ships damaged within 8 minutes, all by underwater strikes? It was unprecedented. Analysts initially suspected a coordinated air attack, but witnesses insisted there were no planes in the sky. What truly shocked the U.S. Navy was not just the loss, but the method. The Type 93 torpedo's range, power, and stealth defied all known expectations. It had been developed in secret, its capabilities largely underestimated, until now. In one night, it had rewritten the rules of naval engagement. The following morning, recovery crews surveyed the debris. Floating life jackets, burning fuel slicks, and fractured hull fragments told the story. Survivors were pulled from the sea, some injured, some in shock, all bearing witness to a moment that would haunt them for life. Naval warfare had entered a new, terrifying phase. As news made its way to Washington, the tone shifted. It was no longer a distant island conflict. It was real. It was devastating. And for the first time since Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy realized the Japanese technological superiority, at least in torpedoes, was a threat they could not afford to ignore. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance received the initial reports with disbelief. 3 vessels struck in under 10 minutes and no aircraft involved? He immediately ordered a secure line to the Office of Naval Intelligence. This had to be more than coincidence. The possibility of a new Japanese weapon had already been floated in strategic circles, but few believed it could be this deadly. Engineers and intelligence officers scrambled to gather data. Survivors described massive underwater blasts that seemed to come out of nowhere with no warning. Sonar readings before the attacks had shown no anomalies, reinforcing the idea that the torpedoes had been launched from extreme range. The only explanation? Something far beyond existing American torpedo design. What they were dealing with, they soon confirmed, was the Japanese Type 93, capable of traveling nearly 40 kilometers at 70 kilometers per hour and delivering a 490-kilogram warhead. By comparison, the U.S. Navy's standard Mark 15 torpedo had half the range, slower speeds, and reliability issues that were already being questioned after Pearl Harbor. The term long lance was coined by Western analysts after learning that the Type 93 used pure oxygen propulsion instead of compressed air, leaving no trail of bubbles. This made them nearly invisible beneath the surface. Combined with their massive payload, they had the ability to cripple even the largest cruisers or battleships with a single hit. In war rooms across the Pacific, urgency replaced confidence. If Japan had deployed even a handful of I-class submarines with these torpedoes, no American fleet position could be considered safe, especially at night. Suddenly, every convoy and destroyer patrol was seen as vulnerable. The psychological impact was devastating. Sailors began to fear not what they could see, but what might be silently gliding toward them. The silence of the sea had become a weapon in itself. Every sonar ping that returned nothing brought less reassurance, not more. The ocean was no longer vast and safe. It was hostile and invisible. Naval planners rushed to adjust their defensive protocols. Convoys were rerouted, zigzag patterns reintroduced, and destroyers were ordered to drop depth charges at the slightest suspicion. Anti-submarine warfare, once seen as secondary to aerial and surface battles, was now a frontline priority. Meanwhile, back in Japan, engineers of the Type 93 were already preparing enhancements. A longer-range variant and timed detonation mechanisms were under testing. Japan's belief was simple. If they could control the sea below, they wouldn't need to dominate the skies above. In Washington, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox briefed the President. His message was clear. The enemy has outpaced us in torpedo warfare, and we're paying the price. Congress soon approved accelerated funding for torpedo redesigns and sonar advancements. It was the beginning of a silent arms race beneath the waves. But it wasn't just technology at stake. It was reputation. The U.S. Navy had always projected strength through its carriers and cruisers. Now that image was fractured by the invisible hands of Japanese innovation. And as the Pacific theater grew darker, Americans would need more than steel and firepower. They would need adaptation. While the Type 93 was making headlines among intelligence circles, few in the American public had any awareness of it. Newspapers were still dominated by Pearl Harbor imagery, unaware that an even more dangerous force lurked beneath the surface. Japanese submarines equipped with the Long-Lance torpedo were still active along Pacific trade routes. These weren't simple attack missions. Japan had designed a doctrine that emphasized stealth and psychological warfare. Their I-boat captains were instructed not only to sink warships, but also to target fuel tankers and supply ships, choking the American logistical chains before major battles could even begin. One such incident occurred off the coast of New Caledonia. The transport vessel USS Neches, while refueling a cruiser group en route to Guadalcanal, was struck by a Type 93. The ship exploded within minutes, forcing the task force to retreat. Not a single Japanese plane had been involved. The fact that these attacks could be carried out by invisible subs positioned dozens of kilometers away meant that traditional patrol strategies had become obsolete. The Pacific, once navigated with relative impunity by Allied ships, was now carved into corridors of uncertainty. It wasn't just the ships that were hit, it was morale. Veterans described the chilling feeling of sailing at night, scanning empty horizons, yet knowing that somewhere out there, a steel tube lurked silently, waiting to release death without warning. The sea had become a haunted place. And yet the U.S. Navy learned fast. Within months, they began rolling out new sonar systems with longer ranges and directional tracking. Convoys were flanked by dedicated destroyer escorts, trained specifically in submarine detection. Experimental depth charge patterns were tested, and nighttime illumination flares became standard in high-risk zones. Countermeasures also included aerial reconnaissance. New aircraft were equipped with magnetic anomaly detectors and underwater microphones. The goal was simple: make the ocean loud again, fill it with enough noise to flush out even the quietest predators. Japanese Naval Command, watching from Tokyo, understood that the clock was ticking. The Long-Lance had given them a surprise edge, but they knew it wouldn't last forever. Plans were made to mass-produce and upgrade, hoping to maintain superiority before the Americans adapted fully. But the arms race had already begun. By early 1943, the U.S. had shortened its torpedo tech gap. The Mark 18 electric torpedo was introduced, slower than the Type 93, but quieter and harder to detect. Submarine warfare was evolving, and neither side would dominate it entirely again. What remained, however, was the legend. Among Allied sailors, the name Long-Lance would become synonymous with fear, invisibility, and precision. And for a brief but terrifying window, Japan had controlled the sea, not through sheer numbers, but through silence and science. While the U.S. military publicly referred to the torpedo attacks as unusual or probable mine strikes, internally they knew what they were facing. Secret memoranda circulated among Pacific Fleet Command, referring specifically to the Type 93 torpedo. The documents were marked top secret, eyes only, and made no mention of this intelligence in any civilian outlet. The classified reports detailed the torpedo's capabilities with chilling precision. 24-inch diameter, over 9 meters long, capable of speeds exceeding 50 knots, and most alarmingly, powered by compressed oxygen instead of air, making its trail nearly invisible. It could travel nearly 40 kilometers. That was unheard of at the time. Military analysts were stunned. Most Allied torpedoes had a range of 4 to 6 kilometers at best. The Japanese had achieved something revolutionary.
What's more, the Type 93 didn't leave the telltale bubble trail that Allied spotters were trained to follow. Ships were being hit before they even realized they were under attack. At the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington, analysts gathered intercepted communications and survivor testimony from wrecked convoys. A pattern emerged. These weren't random submarine strikes. They were calculated, long-range attacks, often launched from undetected positions. The Type 93 wasn't just a torpedo. It was a ghost weapon. The most disturbing revelation came in early 1943, when the wreck of the USS Strong was examined. The ship had been hit by a torpedo that came from a direction over 11 nautical miles away. That was physically impossible based on American torpedo knowledge, until the Long Lance's specifications were confirmed. Behind closed doors, the Navy admitted they had underestimated Japanese engineering. The cultural bias that viewed Japan as technologically inferior had collapsed. Suddenly, the U.S. was facing an enemy that not only matched their innovation, but had surpassed it in a key domain. The psychological effect was severe. Allied sailors began whispering about the death from nowhere. Naval briefings had to be updated. Commanders were instructed to abandon old torpedo avoidance maneuvers. New formations were designed specifically to address the terrifying possibility of unseen torpedo strikes from the horizon. In Japan, meanwhile, the Long Lance had become a symbol. Propaganda posters showed brave submariners launching the torpedo against enemy fleets. Children learned about the weapon in patriotic school books. The engineers behind its creation were honored as national heroes. It was no longer just a tool, it was mythology. But even myths have limits. The U.S. Navy was adapting rapidly. A secret operation, codenamed Black Echo, was initiated to retrieve intact Type 93 torpedoes from sunken I-boats. The goal? Reverse engineer the tech, not just to match it, but to defeat it. In the end, the Long Lance changed the rules of war. It forced the United States to rethink how battles were fought at sea. It shattered the illusion of technological superiority, and for a brief moment in history, it gave Japan the sharpest knife in the ocean.
By mid-1943, the U.S. Navy was no longer caught off guard. The terror of invisible torpedo strikes had forced a full doctrinal overhaul. Fleet formations were adjusted to minimize the effectiveness of long-range torpedo salvos. Destroyers were assigned as forward pickets, zigzagging in unpredictable paths to intercept incoming threats before they reached cruisers and carriers. Naval architects went back to the drawing board. New destroyers were designed with sonar systems specifically tuned to detect low-frequency emissions from submerged I-class submarines. Even torpedo nets, once considered obsolete, were deployed around harbors and anchorages where capital ships gathered. The oceans had become a chessboard, and the U.S. was now playing to win. But perhaps the most decisive change came not from steel or sonar, but from the mind. Psychological training of naval personnel shifted dramatically. Sailors were drilled on recognizing stealth patterns, evasive maneuvers, and coordinated convoy tactics. No longer was the Long Lance viewed as an invincible ghost. It became a predictable, if deadly, variable, one that could be countered through precision and readiness. Meanwhile, Japan continued to rely on the perceived superiority of its torpedoes. Military leadership clung to the belief that technological dominance in a single area could compensate for broader industrial shortcomings. But the U.S. had shifted into overdrive. Production lines expanded. Intelligence units deciphered naval codes, and anti-submarine warfare, ASW, became a science.
In a critical battle off the Solomon Islands, a U.S. destroyer squadron used intercepted transmissions to triangulate the position of a Japanese wolf pack. Rather than avoid the ambush, they charged in, with depth charges pre-primed and searchlights synchronized. The result? 2 I-class submarines destroyed within 10 minutes and a third forced to surface and surrender. For the first time, the hunters became the hunted. The event was broadcast internally as a turning point. A Navy report titled "Reversing the Tide" cited the action as proof that the Long Lance was no longer invincible. Confidence returned to American captains. Torpedo anxiety began to wane. Risk calculations, once dominated by fear of distant strikes, now factored in U.S. countermeasures that were proving effective. But Japan wasn't done yet. In desperation, they began modifying Type 93s with proximity detonators and acoustic guidance systems, experimental tech that pushed the limits of what 1940s engineering could achieve. These new versions, however, lacked the polish of their predecessors and were prone to misfire. American forces retrieved one of these experimental torpedoes after it failed to detonate and lodged harmlessly into the side of a tanker. Engineers in Pearl Harbor dissected it, astonished by its ambition, but also its instability. The weapon had become too complicated, too ambitious. In striving for perfection, Japan had lost the elegant simplicity that made the original Long Lance so deadly. In the final years of the Pacific War, Type 93 torpedoes were still feared, but no longer decisive. Japan's advantage had eroded. The weapon that once shocked the world had been absorbed into the growing archive of U.S. naval intelligence. Charts, countermeasures, and tactical doctrines turned what was once mystery into math. The Long Lance had drawn blood. It had changed naval warfare. But in the end, it could not change the tide of the war. The balance of innovation had shifted, and with it, the future of the Pacific belonged not to secrecy, but to overwhelming adaptation. In the aftermath of World War II, Allied intelligence teams were stunned by what they found in captured Japanese naval archives. Blueprints of the Type 93 torpedo, recovered from destroyed shipyards and naval bases, revealed an engineering marvel that had gone almost unnoticed by the wider world. Even in defeat, Japan had built something revolutionary. Military analysts in Washington and London held closed-door briefings to study the design. The oxygen-fueled propulsion system, previously thought impossible to control reliably, was now viewed as years ahead of its time. Its range, speed, and warhead size surpassed anything the West had fielded during the war. Quietly, several Western navies began experimenting with their own versions of oxygen-powered torpedoes in the years to follow. The Type 93's legacy didn't end in the Pacific. During the Korean War, whispers circulated of Chinese and North Korean submarines deploying long-range torpedoes, technology inspired by Japanese blueprints sold or handed over during post-war chaos. The ghost of the Long Lance had found new oceans to haunt. In the decades that followed, war colleges around the world added entire modules to their naval curricula focused on the Type 93. Historians began calling it the most effective torpedo of the 20th century, not just because of its kill count, but because of the way it reshaped strategy. It had forced navies to think differently about stealth, range, and sudden impact. Interestingly, Japan's own post-war military, reborn as the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, never again produced a torpedo with such range or raw power. The lessons of the past were sobering. Technological brilliance, they realized, was no substitute for resource depth and logistical sustainability. The Long Lance was a masterpiece, but it had been asked to win a war on its own. Naval museums in Tokyo, Honolulu, and San Diego now display preserved examples of the Type 93 encased in glass like sacred relics. Veterans who once feared its arrival from the depths now point at it with reverence. The enemy's weapon had become a monument to innovation and a warning to future generations. In popular media, the Type 93 earned a mythical status. Documentaries, novels, and war games depicted it as the perfect weapon, silent, swift, and unstoppable. While reality was more complex, the myth carried its own weight. It reminded audiences that even the mightiest navies could be humbled by a single underestimated innovation. Today, modern torpedoes use advanced homing systems, wire-guided steering, and satellite integration. Yet in every sonar pulse and propulsion burst, echoes of the Long Lance remain. The engineers who design today's weapons still study the elegant brutality of the Type 93. Strategists reflect on how a single overlooked detail, a torpedo invisible at night, silent in approach, and devastating on impact, can alter the course of nations. The Long Lance didn't just sink ships, it sank assumptions, doctrines, and complacency. And in that way, even in silence beneath the waves, it still sails, an invisible shadow gliding through the minds of admirals and historians alike. In the hushed archives of naval history, where victories and defeats are weighed not just in battles won, but in innovations that shaped the future, the Type 93 torpedo stands alone. It wasn't the most widely used, nor the most famous, but in those critical early months of the Pacific War, it was arguably the most feared. Veterans who survived encounters with the Long Lance described it with a mix of awe and terror. You never heard it until your ship jolted like it hit a mountain, one sailor recalled. The psychological toll of knowing such a weapon prowled silently beneath the waves lingered long after the war ended. In memoirs and declassified documents, commanders admitted they had no answer to the weapon in 1941. Escort ships and convoys weren't prepared for an invisible strike from distances beyond the known effective range. It shattered assumptions, and with them, hulls. The United States Navy, humbled by the shock of early losses, underwent a rapid tactical transformation. Convoy formations were altered. Anti-submarine patrols were expanded. Destroyer roles were redefined. It wasn't just about defeating Japan. It was about never being caught off guard again. In a way, the Long Lance was the alarm bell of the Pacific theater. Its scream wasn't heard, but it echoed in the desperate scrambling of war planners, in the tears of survivors, and in the smoldering hulks left behind. It was a warning carved in salt water and steel. Even today, its story remains a study in imbalance. A struggling island nation, limited by natural resources and overwhelmed by industrial giants, had nonetheless found a way to momentarily dominate the seas through sheer brilliance and courage. For a time, the empire had a fanged shadow beneath the surface. As modern navies invest billions into unmanned submersibles, AI-powered torpedoes, and next-gen sonar arrays, they are perhaps unknowingly chasing the same phantom Japan launched in 1941, an edge, an invisible advantage, a weapon so elegant in design and so terrifying in execution that it changed everything. The Type 93 didn't win the war, but it made the world listen. And in every naval exercise, in every sonar ping, its presence is still felt. A ghost gliding silently through the depths, reminding us all of what happens when brilliance meets boldness in the heat of war. And so ends the journey of the Long Lance, not in silence, but in legacy.